Chapter 6, The Eastern Front, the land of endless retreats and revolutions. While the Western Front descended into a static, mud-choked hell, a very different kind of war unfolded in the East. Here, the sheer vastness of the landscape defied the fixed lines of trenches, allowing for a war of sweeping movements, of colossal armies clashing across immense plains. This was a front where breakthroughs and devastating retreats were commonplace, where the distances were measured in hundreds of miles, and where the human cost spiraled into millions. The Eastern Front was a theater where strategic brilliance was often undone by logistical nightmares, where empires roared their initial defiance only to collapse from within, and where Russia's agony would ultimately lead to a revolution that shook the entire world. The Vastness and the Violence, Opening Horrors in the East, 1914. The early weeks of the war on the Eastern Front immediately shattered any illusions of a quick, decisive campaign. Russia, the formidable steamroller, was expected to crush its Central Power adversaries through sheer weight of numbers. But the reality would prove far more complex, and far more devastating for all involved. Tannenberg's ghost, Germany's decisive blow against Russia. As Germany launched its massive invasion of Belgium and France in August 1914, its eastern flank seemed vulnerable. Two large Russian armies, commanded by Generals Alexander Samsonov and Paul von Rennenkampf, advanced into German East Prussia. Their objective was simple: cut off German forces and relieve pressure on their French allies. Initially, the German Eighth Army, under the aging General Max von Prittwitz, panicked, considering a retreat. But fate, and a bold new command duo, intervened. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, recalled from retirement, and his brilliant, energetic Chief of Staff, General Erich Ludendorff, took command. They immediately grasped the tactical dilemma: two Russian armies, advancing without proper coordination, and crucially, communicating their battle plans in unencrypted radio messages, which German intelligence was avidly intercepting. Ludendorff, with Hindenburg's trust, seized the opportunity. Executing a daring maneuver, they left a thin screen of troops against Rennenkampf's army to the north, while rapidly shifting the bulk of their forces via an efficient rail network southward to confront Samsonov's army. The resulting Battle of Tannenberg, August 26 to 30, 1914, was a masterclass in encirclement. German forces converged on Samsonov's unsuspecting army from three sides, trapping it in the vast, swampy forests south of Tannenberg. The sheer scale of the defeat was staggering: over 92,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner, countless others killed, and the entire Russian Second Army virtually annihilated. General Samsonov, in despair, shot himself. This catastrophic defeat, followed quickly by another German victory against Rennenkampf at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, secured Germany's eastern border and exposed the profound weaknesses in Russia's military: its archaic communication, poor logistics, and sometimes incompetent leadership. Tannenberg became a spectral warning of Russia's immense, yet fragile, power. Galicia's graveyard, Austria-Hungary's fatal floundering. While Germany successfully defended its eastern territories, its main ally, Austria-Hungary, fared far worse. The dual monarchy launched its own ambitious offensive into Russian Galicia, hoping for a swift victory against their larger Slavic rival. But the Austro-Hungarian army, a complex, multi-ethnic force plagued by internal divisions, outdated tactics, and a shortage of modern equipment, was no match for the Russian juggernaut. In a series of bloody engagements throughout August and September 1914, particularly at the Battle of Lemberg, Lviv, the Russians inflicted devastating defeats on the Habsburg forces. Austria-Hungary suffered staggering losses: hundreds of thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured, and its troops were pushed back deep into Galician territory. The fortress of Przemysl, a key defensive stronghold, was encircled and would eventually fall. These early defeats severely eroded the dual monarchy's military strength and exposed its critical reliance on Germany for survival. Galicia became a graveyard for the Habsburg Empire's initial ambitions. Serbia's stubborn stand, the small nation that defied an empire. Even before the larger clashes in Galicia, Austria-Hungary had already stumbled in its first punitive expedition. When Vienna declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, it expected a swift, overwhelming victory against the small Balkan nation it held responsible for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. 3 separate Austro-Hungarian invasions followed in 1914. To Vienna's utter disbelief, Serbia, though small and outgunned, fought with astonishing tenacity and skill. Under the brilliant leadership of commanders like Radomir Putnik, the Serbian army exploited its knowledge of the mountainous terrain, launched daring counterattacks, and inflicted humiliating defeats on the much larger, better-equipped Habsburg forces. At battles like Ser and Kolubara, the Serbs pushed the Austro-Hungarians back, liberating their capital, Belgrade. These early Serbian victories were a powerful morale boost for the Allies and a profound humiliation for Austria-Hungary, further highlighting its military deficiencies and forcing it to divert valuable resources from the main Russian front, contributing to its fatal floundering in Galicia. Shifting sands and shifting alliances, 1915 to 1916. The initial hopes of quick victory faded into a grinding reality. The Eastern Front, unlike the West, remained largely fluid, characterized by massive strategic movements and devastating attritional battles that would test the very limits of human endurance and imperial stability. The Gorlice-Tarnow hammer, Russia's Great Retreat. By spring 1915, Germany had decided to focus its main efforts on the Eastern Front, aiming to knock Russia out of the war. In May, German and Austro-Hungarian forces, under the command of General August von Mackensen, launched the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive in Galicia. Preceded by an overwhelming, unprecedented artillery bombardment, the Central Powers achieved a spectacular breakthrough, shattering the Russian lines. What followed was the Great Retreat, a massive, months-long withdrawal of Russian forces that stretched across hundreds of miles. Millions of soldiers and civilians were displaced. The retreating Russian army, often in disarray, implemented scorched-earth tactics, destroying everything that could be of use to the advancing enemy, bridges, railways, crops, and even entire towns, hoping to deny resources to the Central Powers. Russia lost vast territories, including Poland, Lithuania, and parts of Belarus. The scale of the human and material losses was immense, further crippling the Russian economy, straining its already weak infrastructure, and severely demoralizing its population. This immense defeat was a strategic victory for the Central Powers, but it failed to knock Russia out of the war, instead turning it into a deeper, more brutal war of attrition. Italy's fatal flotation, Alps of blood, mountains of misery. While the Central Powers pressed their advantage in the east, a new front, and a new drain on resources, opened in the south. In May 1915, Italy, swayed by secret promises of significant territorial gains from a crumbling Austria-Hungary, outlined in the Treaty of London, abandoned its neutrality and joined the Entente. This created the Italian Front, a unique and incredibly brutal theater of war fought along the Alpine border with Austria. What followed were the 12 battles of the Isonzo River, campaigns fought not in mud, but on the unforgiving rock and ice of the Dolomite and Julian Alps. Italian and Austro-Hungarian soldiers battled at altitudes exceeding 10,000 feet, often digging trenches into solid rock, clinging to precarious ledges. Artillery barrages triggered devastating avalanches, burying entire companies. Frostbite, rockslides, and falls were as deadly as enemy fire. The conditions were so extreme that many casualties were due to the elements rather than direct combat. Both sides poured vast resources and millions of men into this seemingly endless series of assaults, achieving minimal gains at the cost of over 1 million Italian and 500,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties. This front, though geographically distinct, directly impacted the Eastern Front by diverting crucial Austro-Hungarian resources that might otherwise have been used against Russia. The Brusilov shock, Russia's last roar, and its tragic end. By 1916, Russia was reeling from the Great Retreat, yet it still had one more astonishing, if ultimately self-destructive, blow to deliver. Under the innovative leadership of General Alexei Brusilov, Russia launched a massive offensive in June 1916 against Austro-Hungarian lines in Galicia. Brusilov employed revolutionary tactics that foreshadowed later Western Front strategies, instead of a single, predictable attack point, he launched multiple, simultaneous assaults along a broad front, preceded by short, intense, but highly accurate artillery barrages. He also utilized small, elite, stormtrooper units to penetrate and exploit weaknesses, rather than relying on mass charges. The Brusilov offensive achieved astonishing initial success, shattering Austro-Hungarian lines and inflicting immense casualties, over 1 million, including hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It forced Germany to divert troops from the Western Front, relieving pressure on Verdun, and compelled Austria-Hungary to pull forces from the Italian front. It was arguably the most successful Russian military operation of the war. However, the human cost for Russia was astronomical. While winning battles, Brusilov's army suffered over 1 million casualties of its own. Russia's already stretched logistical system buckled under the strain, and fresh reserves were often poorly trained and equipped. The Brusilov offensive, while a tactical triumph, effectively bled the Russian army dry, exhausting its last reserves of manpower and morale, and hastened Russia's internal collapse. Romania's crushing defeat, a quick and brutal lesson. In August 1916, emboldened by the initial successes of the Brusilov offensive and lured by Allied promises of territorial gains, particularly Transylvania from Austria-Hungary, Romania entered the war on the side of the Entente. It was a strategic miscalculation that would prove devastating. Romania launched an offensive into Transylvania, but its army was ill-equipped, poorly trained, and numerically inferior to the Central Powers it faced. German and Austro-Hungarian forces, aided by Bulgarian troops, swiftly counterattacked. By the end of 1916, Romania's army was crushed, its capital Bucharest captured, and the country largely occupied. This quick and brutal defeat provided the Central Powers with valuable resources, oil and grain, and further shortened their eastern front, but it also necessitated more troops being tied up in occupation duties. Romania's swift collapse served as a harsh lesson about the brutal realities of modern warfare for smaller nations lacking industrial might and experienced leadership. The revolution within, how Russia imploded and changed the war. The Eastern Front, more than any other, exposed the profound vulnerabilities of empires. While the Western Front saw nations locked in external combat, the Eastern Front became the battleground where Russia, the largest of the belligerents, finally imploded, irrevocably changing the course of the war and the shape of the 20th century. The fall of the Tsar, a dynasty crumbles from within. The relentless defeats, the colossal casualties, estimated at 1.7 million killed and 5 million wounded by 1917, and the catastrophic logistical failures inflicted an unbearable strain on Imperial Russia. On the home front, the economy buckled under the weight of war, leading to severe food shortages in cities, hyperinflation, and widespread poverty. The Tsar's disastrous decision in 1915 to take personal command of the army, replacing his experienced general staff, meant he was now directly blamed for every military disaster. His absence from the capital left the government in the hands of his unpopular German-born wife, Empress Alexandra, and her manipulative advisor, the mystic Grigory Rasputin, further alienating the public and the aristocracy. By early 1917, the rot was complete. In February, March by the Western calendar, a series of spontaneous strikes and riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, fueled by food shortages and deep war weariness, escalated rapidly. The army garrisons, ordered to suppress the unrest, instead mutinied and sided with the protesters. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated, discredited, and without support from his generals or ministers, was forced to abdicate on March 15, 1917. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, a symbol of autocratic power, collapsed almost overnight, replaced by a provisional government promising democratic reforms. It was a testament to how quickly the modern lie of an unshakable empire could crumble under internal pressure. Kerensky's last stand, a dying empire's fading hope. Despite the revolutionary fervor, the provisional government, initially led by Prince Georgy Lvov and later by the charismatic Alexander Kerensky, faced an impossible dilemma. Committed to its allies and fearing German punitive peace terms, it felt bound to continue the war. In July 1917, Kerensky, determined to reassert Russia's military credibility, launched a final, desperate offensive on the Eastern Front. The Kerensky Offensive, or the July Offensive, began with initial gains but quickly faltered. The Russian army, demoralized by years of war, plagued by desertions, and increasingly radicalized by Bolshevik propaganda promising peace, land, and bread, lacked the will to fight. Soldiers' committees debated orders, and units often refused to advance. The offensive quickly collapsed, cementing the widespread disillusionment with the provisional government and accelerating the army's disintegration. It was the dying empire's fading hope, proving that even new leadership could not overcome the deep-seated exhaustion and despair of the Russian people. Lenin's triumph, the Bolshevik coup and the promise of peace. The collapse of the Kerensky Offensive and the provisional government's inability to solve Russia's crippling problems, food shortages, land distribution, and above all, the seemingly endless war, created a power vacuum. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, returned to Russia from exile, famously aided by the Germans who hoped he would destabilize Russia further. He tirelessly agitated, promising an immediate end to the war, land for the peasants, and power to the Soviets, workers' councils. On October 25, November 7, by the Western calendar, 1917, the Bolsheviks, with relatively little bloodshed, launched a coup, seizing power in Petrograd. The October Revolution marked the definitive end of the provisional government and the beginning of the Soviet era. True to their promise, one of Lenin's first acts was to issue the Decree on Peace, immediately calling for an end to Russia's participation in the imperialist war and urging all belligerents to negotiate a just peace. For millions of war-weary Russians, this was a beacon of hope, the promise of an end to their agony. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a humiliating peace, a game-changing betrayal. To secure their grip on power and fulfill their promise of peace, the Bolsheviks entered into armistice negotiations with the Central Powers at Brest-Litovsk in December 1917. Russia, militarily shattered by years of war and now embroiled in its own bloody civil conflict, was in no position to bargain. Leon Trotsky, the chief Bolshevik negotiator, famously described the situation as neither peace nor war, hoping for a revolution in Germany that would save Russia from signing a humiliating treaty. But Germany, sensing victory on the Eastern Front and eager to free up troops for a decisive blow in the West, showed no mercy. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, was a brutal dictated peace. Russia lost vast territories: Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Ukraine, and parts of Belarus and the Caucasus. It ceded a third of its population, a third of its agricultural land, and over half of its industry. For Germany, it was a colossal strategic victory, finally ending the two-front war and allowing Ludendorff to launch his desperate spring offensive in the West. For the Allies, it was a profound blow, removing a massive eastern threat to Germany and prolonging their own struggle. But for Russia, it was the agonizing, yet necessary, end to its participation in the Great War, allowing it to turn inward and face its own bitter civil conflict. Caporetto's catastrophe, Italy's near collapse and Allied rescue. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had a ripple effect across Europe, most immediately felt on the Italian front. With Russia out of the war, Germany was able to transfer significant forces, including elite stormtrooper units and heavy artillery, to aid its beleaguered Austro-Hungarian ally. In October 1917, these combined Austro-German forces launched a devastating offensive at Caporetto, now Kobarid, Slovenia. Employing new infiltration tactics and concentrating overwhelming artillery fire, they achieved a spectacular breakthrough, shattering the Italian lines. The Italian army, demoralized by the endless attrition of the Isonzo battles and caught unprepared, suffered a catastrophic rout. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and the army fled in disarray, abandoning vast quantities of equipment. Italy faced near collapse. The Caporetto disaster forced a desperate Allied intervention. French and British divisions were hastily rushed to the Italian front, helping to stabilize the line along the River Piave. A new, more determined Italian command, under General Armando Diaz, rallied the remaining forces. While a crushing defeat, Caporetto ultimately served to strengthen Allied resolve and unify their command structure, setting the stage for their final victorious pushes in 1918. It was a stark reminder that even as one front closed, the endless retreats could still inflict devastating blows,
you enjoyed this
reshaping
video.
The strategic landscape
If you
of
do,
the war.
Please don't forget to like, comment and share this video. Also don't forget to subscribe the channel and press the bell icon, so that you don't miss out the next video. For now, you can continue with the next video or can go through the complete